Let's start with tobacco. I think it's important for us to realize that if we were living in the 18th century, most of us weren't living in the city, we were living in the country. And if we're living in the country, maybe we're owning land, but probably we're not. We're renting land from a wealthy landowner. And if we're doing anything, we're growing tobacco, because tobacco pays the most. So most of us would have been really comfortable in that field. We would have wondered why it's so small. You got a quarter acre here, and it wasn't this close to the city. But most of us had maybe 5 acres or 10 acres of tobacco, depending on how many people we had. But we would have been much more comfortable in the middle of that than we would have in Peyton Randolph's living room. So just as a mindset, just imagine that these hornworms that I'm going to show you aren't all that scary. And certainly a small one like this is not. It's kind of cute, isn't it? Oh, look at him. It's a couple days old. There's a moth called the tobacco hawk. That's what they called it in the 18th century. That flies in at night, lays an egg underneath the leaf. So one of my jobs, and one of the reasons tobacco is so labor intensive, is that each day, each of those leaves on each of the plants has to be checked for these. And if you miss it, then after a couple days, that worm gets, well, kind of big, shall we say.
Oh.
It's a weed.
That's a tomato worm.
Yeah, it's a tomato cutworm.
Tomatoes and the nightshades and tobacco are all in the same family. Solanaceae is the Latin family. And it's not surprising that these pests are cousins of the pests because the plants are cousins. So the tomato hornworm is a cousin of this tobacco hornworm. This one isn't as cute as this one.
No, I wear gloves.
Now there's some out in the field. I guarantee there's some out in the field, and if you want to later on, we can go look for a small one. But we won't have to. So the Landon Carter, who lived in the northern neck. Are you familiar with Virginia geography? We have these rivers and a lot of peninsulas. We got the James, the York, the Rappahannock, and the Potomac. After the settlers came down to Jamestown, a lot of them settled on plantations on the James, but the next river that really got developed was the Potomac. So you have a lot of people on the northern neck, it's called. That's where George Washington is from, that's where the Lees are from, and that's where the Carters are. Now the Carters, there's a guy named Robert King Carter, probably the most wealthy Virginian. Hundreds of thousands of acres, thousands of slaves. He got into the tobacco trade early. He made lots of money. He's got a relative named Landon Carter that in 1750 told us that on the average there are 4,120 hills an acre. We'll round it up to 4,000. Each of his slaves, his adult male slaves, were responsible for 2.5 acres. So if you do the math, that's 10,000 hills for an individual. It's a lot of work. And what that involves is every year you're making new fields, because tobacco does best in virgin territory. So we had a lot of that. We had a lot of forest here in Virginia, and underneath that forest is this very fertile land that can produce tobacco. But there's a couple really bad things about this tobacco plant. I bet you could tell me one. What's really bad about this? Makes cigarettes, yeah, and what it does, there's a drug inside, it's called nicotine, and it's addictive. What that means is if you give it a little bit, you want more. Your body says, oh, I want more. And we were counting on that. See, we got these people in England hooked. Before Columbus sails to the Caribbean, what he thought was India, the people in Europe didn't know about tobacco. They didn't smoke. So here's this crop, and then people are hooked and they want more, and we use that to our advantage. So we kept on giving them quality tobacco, and in the latter part of the 17th century into the 18th century, the world reputation, or the Virginia had a reputation for the best tobacco in the world. And so our job was to keep the quality up. If you could keep quality up, demand would keep up and reputation up, and then prices were up. If you gave them poor leaf or leaves with holes in it, then they would say, oh, that's not so good. So it's not just pleasing to the taste buds, but it's aesthetically pleasing too. So that's why we had to look every day for these tobacco hornworms. So let's start in January. I mentioned Landon Carter because he told us on the average, and he also said that tobacco was a 13-month-a-year crop. That means that every month there's something you can do in your fields. In January and February, you're making new fields. So these people that had 500 acres, they had lots of land that they could cut down. And every year they were cutting down a couple acres. They were saving the tops, they were putting them in piles and they were burning them so the ashes could help bring nutrients to the soil. They would harvest the wood as firewood, and that they would use either for the plantation, or if you're a farmer, you're doing it for yourself. Maybe you're even being industrious and selling it. If you're near Williamsburg, if you go out to Carter's Grove, there's Nathaniel Burrow. In 1774, he sold 100 cords of firewood to the residents of Williamsburg, because these trees weren't here. They were void. I mean, in all likelihood, in the 18th century, we didn't have these big shade trees because they were seen as a source of heat. So anyway, January and February, you're harvesting your trees, you're burning the brushes, and then in March, you create a seed bed. A seed bed is either in the woods or on the edge of the woods, and it's fertile soil. You might take dung or manure from your cows or ash and put it in this pile. And it varies in size, 30 feet by 30 feet. Sometimes it's a quarter acre by a quarter acre. And you rake it up, and then you take your sweet-scented tobacco seed. See, when the settlers first arrived, the Indians were growing their own tobacco because it was domesticated in South America, and through hundreds of generations it was traded, and it was here in the colonies. But that kind of tobacco was harsh, and it was sharp, and it wasn't pleasing to the palates of the English. So John Rolfe in 1612 brings sweet-scented tobacco seed to Jamestown, and it starts the industry of tobacco growing. He later marries this Indian squaw. Anybody have any idea who that might be? Mm-hmm. Pocahontas, that's right. So we remember him because of that. So if you let these plants grow, they'll flower. And this is the carpels, I think, the botanical name, but left over. And each one of these has thousands of tobacco seeds. They're very, very, very tiny. And so it's easy to steal them. I mean, John Rolfe, he didn't tell us where he steals them, but we believe that it was from the island of Trinidad. In South America and Venezuela, there's a river called the Orinoco, and it flows into the Caribbean. At the mouth of this river is Trinidad and Tobago, which were major tobacco-growing areas. So we think that's where he got them from, but we don't know.
So he stole an international trade secret.
That he did. Yeah. He did. Exactly right. It's what we do after we win the war, the Revolutionary War. We take trade secrets from the factories in England. We do the exact same thing. But yes, it was an industrial trade secret that was stolen. And I'm just trying to show you the seeds. They're very tiny. Many bugs get in these. So anyway, you gather your seeds and you go to your seed bed and you scatter them, because that's the old world practice, right? In Europe, that's how you grow wheat. You scatter it. It's not the practice in the New World. I'll come to that in a second. You let these seedlings grow up until they're about 5 or 6 inches. They're about this size. They said that when the leaves are a shilling width, that's when you transplant them. And everybody in your house or everybody on the plantation was dedicated to this very delicate task of taking these seedlings from your seed bed into the hills. So in March, after you sow your seeds, you make hills. Again, each person, 10,000 hills. So you're out in the field a long time making these hills. And then you transplant it during transplanting season, which is when it's overcast and rainy, because that's when it's best to do any kind of transplanting, right? So when that occurs, and there's usually a window between April and May when you transplant them. And then you let them go. And then you weed. And we had to weed 3 times in this field. And I think that the field now is largely weed-free because we have a lot of time on our hands. And there's 2 of us, and we deal with a quarter acre. I think it's my belief that there's a lot more weeds, but we're a museum and we want it to look nice. So feel free to tell me it looks nice anytime you want. So these go into the ground in mid-May, early June, and they're in the field for about 3 months. June, July, and August. And what we have to do is we have to weed each hill, We have to search for cutworms initially, and then it's tobacco hornworms, and we're doing that every day. A couple weeks ago, we started topping, and now we're going to move into the field. But before we do, I'm going to ask if there's any questions. Yesterday.
Now wait a minute. You said you can't do it but so long. Is there a fallow time and then you can come back and plant again tobacco?
William Tatum in 1780, he wrote this book about tobacco culture. And he said that you could plant tobacco in a field for 2 years. Then you had to let it go for 10 before you planted it in tobacco again. So typically farmers would plant tobacco because it was the cash crop. They can get the most money out of it. Then they would go to wheat in that field, or corn, or straw, or pasture, or orchard, another thing. And most of them did not go back to tobacco after 10 years. Most of them moved on. So tobacco starts in Tidewater around Jamestown, and then it spreads, and then it goes to the Piedmont, which it was in the second half of the 18th century. It was between Richmond and the mountains. That's Piedmont. Then it goes over the mountains into the valleys, and then in the 19th and 20th century, it goes all the way to Kentucky. And that's where it is now. Most tobacco grown in the U.S. is grown in Kentucky, Tennessee, Carolinas, Western Virginia, and there's also places in Ontario, the Connecticut River Valley, Louisiana, these different places. And the Amish in Pennsylvania, they're experimenting this year for the first time in a nicotine-free kind of tobacco. Kind of an odd notion, sort of like decaffeinated coffee, but we went there, and they're hoping that people are going to go for these non-nicotine cigarettes, but we'll wait and see. I don't know a lot about modern day practices, but it's phenomenal when I get a farmer that comes and he tells me that the tobacco plant now gets 20 leaves on it. In the 18th century, it only got 6 to 8. And they still have to top it by hand, which we're going to go to in just a second. So yesterday we harvested our first crop, and this is what it looks like. And I'll tell you how we harvest it when we get out to the fields. Did I clear that up? One thing that's easily confusing is that they did believe in crop rotation, but not how we think about it. We think about, wheat, corn, soybean, and we just rotate them and move them around because we're all getting money for these different crops. They wanted to grow tobacco because it provided money. And then after they grew tobacco, then whatever they could. They weren't making a lot of money growing corn, but the House of Burgess saw to it that they had to. They passed a law in the latter part of the 17th century that says if you grow 5 acres of tobacco, you also, by law, have to grow an acre of wheat and an acre of corn. And that's to feed your brothers that were living in the city. Right? Because you weren't making money growing corn and wheat, but you had to feed everybody. I mean, they needed food. So most of us wanted to grow a crop that wasn't edible. So, and most of our crop went to England.
Does the plant have to be dry to use it, or can you use it green?
The other uses of tobacco, which are very fleeting and we don't have a lot of evidence of people writing about it in the 18th century, is you could make a tea from the green leaves and give it to children, and that would get rid of worms. They sometimes planted it in their garden for looks because it was supposed to keep some insects away. I believe personally that all plants repel some insects and attract others. So if you have a variety of plants, you have all these different animals that are put away, then you also have some that are attracted. So we know about that today, right? Marigolds next to the tomatoes. Tansy, if you're familiar with tansy keeps a lot of bugs away. And in the 18th century, they would plant tansy right next to the door to keep and they would make a tea out of tansy, and then they would paint their window with this tansy tea to keep the bugs out.